We have a president that thinks that ISIS has been contained. We have a president that doesn't know what's happening.
There you go. Republican presidential frontrunner Donald Trump last night in Worcester, Mass., attacking Obama instead of the GOP, while also reiterating his plan to eliminate the threat of ISIS. Trump added today that he would not rule out a database special for Muslims here in the United States. Also, some GOP types thought a lack of foreign policy experience would end both Trump and Ben Carson's campaigns. According to Politico, the losers are going to be Donald Trump and Ben Carson on national security, said Caton Dawson, the former chairman of the South Carolina GOP. Quote, as the Republican base sobers up, they are the two. If this story lasts a long time, it's going to hurt. For Carson, sure. For Trump, it's actually having the opposite effect.
And joining us again, Republican strategist Ford O'Connell and senior political contributor at Forbes.com, Rick Ungar. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Always a pleasure to have you.
Good to be here with you guys.
All right, Ford, we're going to start with you because I kind of lump you into that category of the GOP establishment types. Don't take it personally.
Wow.
Do you like that? Is that a compliment, Ford?
All right. So there were those who were saying that this Paris attack would be the end of Donald Trump and Ben Carson, but it's actually, in my opinion, had the opposite effect. Donald Trump seems to be the guy that most people trust to deal with a situation. Does that make you nervous at all?
No, it doesn't make me nervous. Let's start with Ben Carson first. I've long said policy acumen is going to be his downfall. And when he talks about national security and foreign policy, he looks like a deer in the headlights. He was attractive because he's a political amateur, but if this continues, the rubber's going to meet the road and Ben Carson's going to meet his demise.
All right.
With respect to Donald Trump, I'll tell you why it's not having effect on him. Because the field is wide. There's a certain segment of working class white males that are attracted to the fact that he talks tough. As long as the field is wide, Donald Trump's in good shape, even on foreign policy.
All right, so the field's not quite as wide as it was just yesterday. Bobby Jindal dropping out, though. But let me ask you this, Rick. Should Ford be concerned? Because every time we think Donald Trump is on the wane, something comes along like the Paris attacks, and it elevates him back up to the top of the polls in a commanding way. Should Republicans be concerned if they do not like the idea of Donald Trump, the GOP nominee?
Well, it's not just Republicans. I mean, if I were a Republican, I'd be concerned that Donald Trump might be my nominee because I'm pretty comfortable he's going to get beat in a general election. Whether or not attacks like this have an impact on it, I don't know. I've heard nothing from Donald Trump that would suggest that he has a really coherent idea how to approach this significant, horrible problem. But then again, if that's what the Republicans want, I think they should have it.
So is it just the way the message is being delivered? You look at Donald Trump, he's very forceful, he's out there. And Ben Carson seems a little bit lost. And we'll play an example of that coming up out of the commercial break. But is it just the style over the substance that really matters right now, Ford?
Absolutely, it is a style over the substance, because I told you it's who his target demographic is. Working white class males between 50 to 64. If he wants to actually get beyond that, even though it's working very well for him, he's going to have to change his style a little bit more. But right now it's working for him. And that's Ben Carson's problem. Because he doesn't have a specific style, you can tell that he doesn't know much about the substance.
And I'm just curious when he's going to get specifics, although I thought it was interesting when we were talking about how he's really targeting Muslims right now. He's not being totally specific, but he's not ruling out things either, Rick. Should this alarm?
No, he's not ruling out things.
Like warrantless searches.
Depends. Yeah, I mean, he's suggesting all sorts of things that violate more amendments to the Constitution than I can count. There is apparently people in this country who don't have a problem with that. And they're usually the very same people who stand up and say, I'm a fundamental interpreter of the Constitution. And then Donald Trump says these things and they go, yeah, man. So what are you going to do? Confuse people? They're going to have confused ideas.
Well, Ford,
let me say one thing to that, Rick. I do agree that the number of constitutional laws that he may violate could actually cause you and me to hatch a Supreme Court justice based on what he said. But I will say the one thing that is true is he's basically saying overall, if we take a step back, we're going to have to take a new approach to this because basically the tactics have changed and the technology's changed. So I do see where he's going. I just don't like what's coming out of his mouth.
One last question before we take it. One last question before we take a
I've
commercial
never
break.
heard him say anything that coherent. Forbes ought to be writing his speeches.
Maybe he is. I want to ask you guys one last question before we take a commercial break real quick. I've asked this to a lot of folks. This Paris story, do you think this is something we're still going to be talking about in this way if there is not another attack, say, a month from now?
You start with.
Great question. It's hard to say. I mean, it'd be easier to say if you asked me if we'll be talking about it in 6 months, I'd say no, as long as there's not another one. I don't know. It's a great question. I don't know if here in America we'll be talking about it a month from now. Certainly the French will. It really depends on what the result of it is. We have a very short memory for these sort of things.
All right, yes or no, Ford?
Well, we do have
go.
a short memory, but the more attacks it is, unfortunately, the better it is for Republicans, because national security is President Obama's weak spot.
All right, we're coming right back with Ford and Rick. After this, we're going to talk more about Donald Trump with today's roundtable with Dick Morris coming up here shortly. But we're also going to talk about Hillary Clinton's new plan today that she's going to use to take on ISIS. Is it something that could prove challenging for the Democratic frontrunner in the general election?
Last night on the O'Reilly Factor, things got, well, a little bit frustrating.
You could really feel it.
You could feel it when it came to interviewing Dr. Ben Carson on his foreign policy plans.
We need to get all of our allies involved, both the ones in the Middle East and the NATO allies.
Got to have a plan, Doc. I mean,
we actually should ask them to get involved without question.
well, we should declare
but we can't
war.
depend on them.
If the NATO nations don't declare war, then they don't have to be a part of NATO anymore. I mean,
You can feel it, right? Right? So uncomfortable I could barely read it. At the same time, yesterday's New York Times headline read, Carson is struggling to grasp foreign policy. Trump responded to the headline, telling a reporter this, when the New York Times says essentially from his top advisor and a couple others that he's essentially incapable of learning foreign policy. I mean, that's pretty sad. Try to say it in his voice.
Very nice, Miranda.
Thank
Rejoining
you.
us for part two of the roundtable, Republican strategist Ford O'Connell and senior political contributor at Forbes.com, Rick Ungar. Also today, Dr. Ben Carson is trying to distance himself a little bit from close advisor Armstrong Williams. A little trouble there on the campaign trail. Ford, how serious is this for Dr. Ben Carson?
Well, if foreign policy stays the top issue, this is extremely serious for him. Let me say one thing to Miranda's comments when she said it looks terrible. Yes, it looks terrible, but you got to understand something about foreign policy and the presidential campaign trail. This stuff takes years to learn.
Oh,
I don't care
sure.
if you went to Yale and worked as a doctor at Johns Hopkins. You can't crib sheet this stuff, and unfortunately, that's going to be a major problem for Ben Carson down the road.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's talking about it. It's very apparent, and I don't know who he's surrounding himself with, but you could sit there and say, okay, the man obviously was a neurosurgeon, so of course he doesn't know a lot about foreign policy. But then you also have to question his decision-making when it comes to who he surrounds himself
Well,
with
I would ask,
and who he's going to learn about foreign policy. I mean, Rick, don't you agree? I mean, you're a political analyst. Or not you, I'm sorry,
yeah,
I mean Ford.
No,
I fully agree with you, Miranda, but this is what happens when you have a political amateur. At first, it looks great. It's the shiny object. People are sick and tired of it, but foreign policy is something that literally political insiders know best about. And to your point about his organization, when you don't understand how these organizations run, it's why an advisor goes rogue on you. And that's the whole point here. And that's why, unfortunately, it's going to backfire for Ben Carson, who I think is a good man. And if he spent some time in government, he very well could be president of the United States.
To Ford's point there, Rick, are we grading these guys on a curve, though? Are we giving Dr. Ben Carson not enough slack because he is a brain surgeon? We do expect him to know this stuff right off the bat?
Well, I don't know if we should be cutting him that much of a break. Nobody said he had to run for president, brain surgeon or whatever somebody might do. So, no, I don't think we can be too tough on them. But then again, I don't think anybody is being too tough on any of these candidates. So I don't quite get it. Yeah, I think Ford does have it right, though. You know, if it does take years to be an expert in foreign policy, then I would imagine people should be concerned about a candidate who doesn't have those years, and we know who they are. Then beyond that, you have to examine even those who do have experience, to see if their foreign policy meets what you think is the right way to go. I actually don't necessarily agree that it takes years. I do think that Dr. Carson, for whatever reason, is not comfortable with it and is struggling to get a better grasp on it than he's got.
All right, I asked you guys if we'd still
Can
be...
I say one more thing, Rick?
Go ahead,
I'll tell you
Ford.
why
Go
it
for it.
takes years. And the answer is the American population doesn't follow foreign policy any closer than I follow what goes on in the WNBA. And unfortunately, the only time we talk about it is when something goes boom, boom. So that's the problem.
I think that's true for your average American. I buy that for it, I do. But when you're running for president, there are certain things you have to take upon yourself, and one of them is to study this stuff. Look, the average American's not going to lock themselves up in a room and become an expert in foreign policy. When you're running for president, you better do just that.
Well, they better bone up on this before the next debate, December 15th, because, you know, I asked you guys if we'd still be talking about this in a month, but I bet it comes up at the debate no matter what. Let me ask you guys one more question. Let's say we are still talking about it, and this is still one of the main topics on the campaign trail. Give me your three candidates other than Donald Trump who are best suited to benefit politically from this. Go ahead, Ford.
Rubio, Cruz, and Bush.
Bush. Out of those three, who do you think is best suited for this?
Well, the problem is I can't really grade them based on that. I have to grade them on the perception of the rest of them. I would
Give
then
me one
say
name.
Rubio and Bush.
We got to get to Rick, too. Give me one name.
Rubio,
All
because
right,
he's
go
actually
ahead,
put
Rick.
his whole campaign on the back of foreign policy since the beginning.
Go ahead,
Okay,
Rick.
Rick.
I would say Clinton, Clinton, and Clinton.
Oh, touche.
Shocker.
As one might
Shocker.
expect.
That's why you have
Touche.
to have a Dio, right, from the last debate.
She's doing very well in the polls, though.
Let's
right
just
now.
be honest. Everything we see from here on out is all a big show. It's over. Hillary Clinton is going to be the nominee. You heard it here
I'll agree on
first.
that.
I long told you that a long time ago.
All right, I'll give you a little credit there, Ford. Ford and Rick, thanks so much for being with us. Always a pleasure, gentlemen. Always a good debate.
This needs to be to take out ISIS. We can't do it alone, but we need to have a strategy.
Coming up next, so what's Jeb Bush's strategy to fight ISIS? You can find out tonight during Prime with J.D. Hayworth. That's starting at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, 5 o'clock Pacific Time. And there's still time for you to weigh in. We want to know what you think about Gerald Fogel's prison plea deal.
Henry repeats.